We're now going to have conversation about the central topic of today, a transition that is sustainable and inclusive. So I'd like to invite Luiz Esteves, the Chief-Economist for the Bank of Northeast, to moderate this session. Also, we'd like to invite Mr. Martin Rama and Paulo Medas for the discussions. Welcome you all to the fourth day of our forum. Thank you, Adalgisa. Good morning, everyone. I'd like to thank you for the invitation of ABDE to moderate this round table on a sustainable and inclusive transition. And also, I'd like to congratulate the organization of this event, very high level. Third, I'd like to thank our speakers, Mr. Martin Rama and Paulo Medas. It is a pleasure being here with you and sharing this discussion with you. And also, I'd like to apologize the fact that I will have to use my mask because of my regulations here where I am. But this may be good news for the panel. So we're going to divide this panel into 3 parts. We have 15 minutes, 50 minutes, and we will divide into 3 parts, 3 sessions. We're going to start with a 15-minute presentation by each one of the guests. And then, secondly, we're going to discuss, and I will monitor questions or comments in the chat, which we'll address. And finally, we're going to have final remarks by our speakers. So I'd like to start with the first presentation in this first part of the event, and I'd like to ask Dr. Martin Rama for his presentation. It is a pleasure welcoming you here today. You have the floor.
Good morning, Luiz. Good morning, Paulo, and good morning, everybody. My pleasure to be with you at ABDE today. I will like to share a few thoughts on the crisis, the COVID crisis, and its implications for growth and for a sustainable recovery with you, building on our semi-annual report for the region. At the World Bank, twice a year, in around March and around September, we publish an update on where the region is and what the prospects are. And I would like to make, because I only have 15 minutes, a few points that we can then discuss. The first point is that the severity of the crisis in Latin America and the Caribbean is bigger, harder, stronger than what we think. Second, that there is enormous uncertainty in terms of the recovery, even on the numbers, and I will share some information to suggest that things may not be today exactly the way we think they are. And then I want to, perhaps in a bit counterintuitive way, claim that this crisis is not just a reason to be very negative in our forecast about the future, but it may be bringing a few good things under the form of disruption. So I will make 2 points on how disruptions may give us economic progress in areas where through reforms we have been very slow, and how disruption may give us a cleaner path to growth. So if you allow me, I will share my screen just to show a few slides. I hope that you can see it, my presentation now. I have to, sorry, I'm moving this because it's blocking my view. Sorry. So this is the report I was referring to. There is the link there. The first point I made is the crisis was probably worse than we thought. One exercise we do in this report is to look at the death toll that the region suffered. When this crisis started, we were expecting the death toll from COVID to be the worst in the least developed countries because of the weak institutional capacity, because of their weak healthcare systems. It turned out that at least in 2020, most of the impact was in advanced economies and in Latin America and the Caribbean. And what we do here is to compare the official deaths from COVID-19, which are in the horizontal axis per million people accumulated over 2020, with the excess mortality. Excess mortality is we take the deaths observed in 2020 and we compare with a normal year, which is an average of the previous 5. And you will expect perhaps the two figures to be aligned on the 45-degree line, which you see here. And it's true that for some countries like Belgium, like France, but also Chile and Brazil, basically the two figures coincide. But you see also a few other things. First is that the Latin American countries, the ones that are in dark purple, are much higher up than the rest of the world. You may say this is because we are missing countries that have such weak institutions that they don't have mortality data. But we checked for the few countries in Africa where we could check, countries in Africa resemble the green dots, not the purple dots. If you look at these dots, what you realize is that for one death from COVID-19, one official death around the world, you can count 1.3 deaths in terms of excess mortality. In our region, you can count 1.9. And what you will see also is that the region has enormous diversity between a very hard heavy toll on death in the Andean region to a relatively mild or even negative in the case of Uruguay in 2020. Uruguay is now going through a very harsh second wave. But so you see a big discrepancy. So we know that the region had the worst impact in economic terms, the biggest decline in GDP across all regions in 2020, all developing regions. What we claim here is the death toll was in general much higher than what we expected. Second point is this crisis has a lot of uncertainties. It's a new crisis. Our models didn't have supply shocks like those that come from lockdowns. We don't know how to model that. There has been enormous uncertainty on the way the pandemic will unfold, second waves, vaccines. There has been a surprising heterogeneity in the capacity of governments to respond to the crisis. Governments we thought were very capable were not so much able to handle it. So we have some skepticism on the numbers, even our numbers, even if our report has our forecast. And one thing we do, in my second point, is we use satellite data, real-time data on nitrogen dioxide emissions as a proxy for economic activity, because nitrogen dioxide is what comes from exhaust, chimneys, is very highly correlated with economic activity, with different elasticities by country, but we take that into account. And here's what we get. We can measure nitrogen dioxide emissions by very tiny tiles around the world every day, thanks to data from NASA. Here you have a comparison of economic activity with the last quarter of 2019, the last normal quarter, let's say, before the COVID crisis. And you see that in the midst of the pandemic of the first wave, quarter 2, 2020, everybody's in the red, and in the red very significantly. These are GDP numbers. These are transformations from NO2, nitrogen dioxide, to GDP. And you see very negative numbers. You see that very quickly, by third quarter, China and Vietnam are already into blue territory. So they are above the last quarter of 2019. And the trend continues in quarter 4, 2020. Now, if we do this for the first quarter of 2021, what we see is that except for Europe and in Latin America, Venezuela, we are already into mild positive territory. And you may wonder why this is so. Our numbers from national accounts are not telling this. There could be measurement issues. But again, the measurement issues on the nitrogen dioxide side, but also we believe that some of our instruments to measure economic activity may not be the best suited at a time when a lot is happening through virtual mechanisms and through teleworking and the like. Third point I want to make is that while there are many reasons or several good reasons to be very negative, to be very pessimistic about the impact of the COVID pandemic, there are also a few hints for optimism. The negative reasons are well known. We have human capital that has been lost, children not going to school. We have over-indebted economies, over-indebted firms. We have people who have withdrawn from the labor market, especially women. All that is very bad, so the negatives are there. But for the first time in Latin America, we're having a very strong structural change. This is something that was difficult to accomplish through economic policy. For instance, our region has the most free trade agreements of any region except Western Europe, and still the ratio of trade to GDP has not moved. Now we have entire sectors of the economy collapsing, tourism, personal services, and sectors booming, logistics, ICT, finance. And it turns out that the productivity of the sectors booming is generally bigger than the productivity of the sectors contracting. So one exercise that we do is to think, well, if the economy was to go back not to where it was in 2019, but to the structure we are seeing at the end of 2020, and we were to reweight productivities by sector with this change in the composition, then you will see that there are sectors that will be gaining just from this sectoral change. Of course, in the short term, we only have the negative. We have the negative impact. But there is some truth to this story when you think of the case of Argentina. Just to caricature, but taking an extreme case, Argentina had a terrible crisis in 2020. Its GDP fell by $56 billion in 2020. The value of the three biggest IT companies in Argentina, just the three biggest, increased by $66 billion. Of course, that increase is not GDP, and by the way, it's not taxable, easily taxable by the government. That shows the kind of transformation and the challenges it is posing. One thing the report does is to assess, and I will go very quickly, how prepared the region is for digitization across a range of indicators. Why we do this? Because we think that digitization is one of the biggest transformations that is coming from this crisis. And digitization may be a disruptor, not just that the ICT sector is more productive. Digitization may be changing finance, where access to finance was really low for Latin America and the Caribbean compared to its development level. It may help us with formalization. Of course, we now see a lot of people working on deliveries, and those are informal jobs, but that's just by design. We could know how much they earn. We could have social protection, health insurance that covers these people. It may be good for trade integration. So we do this benchmarking, and what we find, very interestingly, is two things. One is, roughly speaking, half of the population of Latin America and the Caribbean will not benefit from digitization just because they don't have internet or they have internet that is too expensive. But also across countries, we see a big difference. This is the distribution of unicorns. This is big companies that are valued more than $1 billion that have been financed through venture capital and that are still private. And you see this value of the companies, the unicorns, in percent of GDP. And you see, of course, that the Estonias and the Singapores and the Chinas of the world are leading. But you see Brazil and Argentina and Uruguay and Colombia in that league. Same thing if you look at unicorns per capita. Last point, if I may have 1 minute, is another disruption that we may have in our hand, and that's in the energy sector. And here's where the sustainability comes in. Latin America and the Caribbean, especially Latin America, has the cleanest energy matrix in the world. We have a lot of hydropower, wind, potential for solar. So we should have the cheapest energy, the cheapest electricity in the world, even including carbon tax to account for emissions. And instead, you have here, this is what the cost should be if we were efficient, the cost of electricity. Here's what the cost of electricity is for firms in Latin America and the Caribbean, the most expensive. and this is what it is for households. I will not enter into the details of why this is so. Part of it is because other regions subsidize electricity a lot, but a lot is because of inefficiency in our region. And there are two, again, disruptions that we can tap: distributed generation, electricity trade, that could give us cheaper electricity, more energy, and therefore more growth. Thank you very much. I will stop sharing now.
Gostaria de agradecer, muito interessante.
Thank Martin for the interesting presentation with very interesting inputs for our discussion. I have some questions, and we are also keeping an eye on participants' questions, but I'll leave that to the second part. So we'll move on straight to the second presentation by Paulo Medas from the IMF. Please, Paulo, you have the floor. Thank you once again for joining us.
Okay, thank you very much for the invitation. We are in the midst of a crisis, a pandemic, but we are starting to see the light at the end of the tunnel. But much more progress is needed, and the priority is obviously vaccination, getting everyone vaccinated. Because that's the only moment we are really going to be exiting this crisis. Nevertheless, it is time to start thinking about the recovery. And as Martin mentioned, to some degree, this also creates an opportunity to rethink a little bit on how to improve economies and efficiency and getting go to slide 2. So one characteristic we have seen in this crisis, which was unique in many ways, was that governments have taken unprecedented measures in size, but also in scale, in the sense of reaching all families and firms to help save lives and livelihoods. Based on a survey that we collect information on data, we added that the discretionary measures by governments around the world added to around $16 trillion. They were mainly in advanced economies, but some emerging markets, including Brazil, have taken significant measures, especially in 2020. This included additional spending, subsidies, transfers, but also loans and guarantees to firms. For example, among the G20 advanced economies, half of the above the lines of the spending revenue support was devoted to employment protection and households' income. Among emerging markets, we have seen significant public works, like typically aimed at infrastructure investment, but also employment protection. So this has been really unique in the sense of the size of action, the quick action of governments to help people. Of course, these measures were absolutely necessary, but they also meant a cost. And what we have seen the cost for government is the very large increase in deficits, and that to some degree will persist in time. Here I'm showing projections, comparing the projections of our latest World Economic Outlook that the fund published recently, for example, that in the red line, and compare it to the pre-pandemic projections that we had, which was at the time of January 2020 in the Economic Outlook release. And as you can see, comparison, there's been a very large increase in debt, especially among the advanced economies, which was already high, but it's now really at record high levels. And to a less degree, but the same pattern, we have seen very large increases in public debt among emerging markets. Deficits, government deficits have been also at very large levels. For example, on average, among advanced economies, the fiscal deficits averaged almost 12% of GDP in 2020 and almost 10% of GDP among emerging markets. So this has been, again, a necessary measures governments have taken, but together with a large economic contraction and reduction in taxes led to very, very large deficits and a high debt that countries will to manage looking forward. Also, the crisis has left many scars. And as Martin mentioned, there is still a lot of uncertainty at the depth and the size of the damage that we will see from this crisis. We have seen, for example, here I'm comparing just emerging markets. And again, I'm comparing the path that was expected GDP in each of these economies before the pandemic, which is the blue line, and the latest projections, which is the red line. And as you can see, even though our projections have been upgraded to previous projections, we expect GDP to remain significantly below what we were projecting before the crisis. In all countries except China, which we will expect to converge to the pre-pandemic trends. But Brazil, South Africa, India, and many other emerging markets, we expect they will not recover to the trends that we had seen pre-crisis. But this is not just about growth. We are also seeing significant increases in poverty and inequality. For example, many workers will also need to find new jobs. And we have seen children's education has suffered. So in our latest fiscal monitor, we estimate that the children from poor families have been disproportionately affected by this crisis. We estimate that up to 6 million children in emerging markets and developing economies could drop out of school in 2021 with lifelong adverse consequences. So for poverty, but also for productivity and for the growth of the country. Now, turning to what should be the agenda for governments in the years ahead in terms of the economic recovery. As I mentioned, the country governments are going to face very difficult challenges and address these many scars of the crisis in the midst, again, of incredible degree of uncertainty about the future. One of the things we have stressed in reports is that many countries are now facing increasingly less fiscal space to act. They have acted a lot, debt is high, deficits are high. So it is important to have a credible medium-term fiscal framework, in the sense that it's important to explain to markets that governments understand that they're going to have to contain debt, bring it to more sustainable levels, but at the same time, it's important to support economy, people, businesses, for some time more until the recovery is entrenched. It's also going to be important for governments to think of strategies how to support economic activity, but also create new jobs as we see a structural transformation of the economies, and to prevent that the increase in poverty that we have seen becomes more persistent. It's really important to move fast to avoid that would have significant scares, long-term scares for the economy. So one point I wanted to make is that, building also Martin's point, is that governments have policy choices now that are going to have very long-term impacts. This is a moment that the policymakers have to really think how to start rebuilding their economies and how to do it better. So making economies more inclusive, greener, and more resilient to crisis. So what we have seen is that in many cases, in many economies, governments were not well prepared for this crisis, which affected really the most vulnerable parts of our society. So some of the points we raised in our report is the importance of investing in health systems, including expanding vaccinations, the ability to respond quickly to this crisis, but also education and infrastructure. And when you're talking about infrastructure, also think about how you link that to accelerate the transition to a more digital, green economy. It's also going to be an important aspect. But also another importance linked to resilience, strengthening social protection systems, help during crisis and counter inequality and poverty. Here's absolutely critical governments ensure provision of basic services and goods to everyone, especially during crisis. So let me focus now, just as an example, limited time, on two aspects I would like to stress. One is the role of public investment. We think that this is really a time to focus on public investment. Why? First, interest rates remain relatively low, private savings are high, and the private sector is still in a wait-and-see mode. So private investment remains relatively depressed, partially due to the high uncertainty. And people, firms are waiting to see about the future. We are seeing some reaction, but we don't know how sustainable this is. So public investment can help this process. It can help because also there are complementarities between public investment and private investment. And our evidence shows that in moments of high uncertainty, the effects, the multiplier effects of public investment, impacts on growth are quite large. Second, even before the pandemic, as I show here in the chart, public investment was relatively low for over a decade in many countries. So we have seen public capital stocks actually declining in countries. So there is a significant infrastructure needs in many emerging economies along. This is also another important reason why to focus on investment. And as I mentioned before, another area is climate change. Climate change will involve several aspects. Will involve carbon taxes, which it's a key part of the strategy, but also investment. For example, in our report, we also estimate that the adaptation needs in terms of investment would cost around 1% of global GDP every year. Of course, varying country for country, but there is a need. This is an opportunity that governments are going to increase public investment. This is one they should focus on. Another aspect I wanted to mention, it's one area we've been working with many countries, is you should invest now, but you should do it well. So what we see is that there's still a lot of resources that are supposed to be directed to investment, but they are lost. They are lost because of inefficiencies. They are lost because of corruption, because of governance. So it is very important to really ensure that this is done in a way with a high degree of governance. We also noticed one important area is building the capacity to invest well. We see that in periods where countries are increasing significant investment, this leads to even larger cost overruns of projects. It's important to really invest on investing well. And I just wanted to take the occasion also to advertise a book we have published recently exactly on these issues, which is called Well Spent and How Strong Infrastructure Government Can End Waste Public Investment. So this is absolutely critical in the period that fiscal deficits are high, where public finances are under stress. It's important that every dollar is well spent. Another aspect I wanted to focus is on strengthening social assistance. And I know I'm out of time, so let me just be very quick. So the crisis has demonstrated the vital importance of social safety nets that can be quickly activated to provide lifelines to struggled families. High social spending is effective, can be very effective in reducing poverty, but only when it provides adequate assistance and covers the poorest segments of society. we really have seen during this crisis governments struggling and having to come up with very quickly with solutions to reach those that were most vulnerable in this crisis, because the existing systems were not doing as good a job as we expected, even though some countries were able to provide very effective assistance. For example, Brazil in 2020, at the height of the crisis, created new programs that help prevent the rise in poverty. But these were, again, emergency programs, and it's important to think through long-term having this social assistance, social safety nets that are permanent and that are well designed and they can be cost effective while being really protection. One thing I wanted to mention also is that what we see is that there's sometimes a disparity between what are the best tools and what countries are using more. So, for example, what we see in our evidence and others, including us, is that cash transfers can be very effective. But in fact, they are less used than others, which are less effective in reaching the poorest. So it's also important to think through carefully about the best tools to get the most vulnerable. So in sum, to finish, governments have gone to exceptional lengths to shore up their economies, but further work is needed ahead of the pandemic, including vaccination, but also provide support to continue to provide support to households and firms until the recovery is firmly in place, and set the stage for a recovery that is greener, fairer, and more durable. So some of the elements I have mentioned have a medium-term fiscal strategy that manages the high levels while contributing for this inclusive economic growth, more resilient and green economy. This, in many countries, because fiscal space is very limited, will require private prioritization of spending and enhancing efficiency, and in some cases will imply higher taxes to finance these needs. We also advocate in our report that countries can do more to reduce inequality, which was exacerbated by the pandemic. And this means both pre-distributed measures like investing in education, investing in health, and redistributive policies like more progressive taxation. This can help break the vicious cycle of inequality. And it's really important to, especially to keep social cohesion in these times of crisis, that governments make an effort to provide better access to basic services. Again, stressing once more vaccines is absolutely critical now, but also social safety nets for now and for the future, for future crises. But for this, the governments also have to strengthen transparency and accountability to the taxpayers and to the public in general. Okay, and I'll stop here and to discuss. I'll stop the presentation. Thank you.
Perfeito. Gostaria de agradecer mais uma vez. Eu acho que a gente está tendo oportunidade.
Once again, we have the opportunity to have a very high-level discussion. The presentations by Martin from the World Bank and Paulo from the IMF. I have some comments on some important points that you both mentioned. So I'll start with 2 points brought up by Paulo that we should take into account. The first is the circumstances with which we, or under which we were hit by the COVID-19 pandemic. We already had a situation, a post-2008 crisis situation. Many countries were still seeking fiscal consolidation given the increase in fiscal debt, because we didn't have much fiscal room even before COVID, and several countries were making an effort towards fiscal consolidation, and they were all surprised by this very negative and strong shock. And this somehow had an even worse impact on public accounts, because it does require that all countries in the world, regardless of their level of development, they have to seek resources to increase efficiency. And the second point is
the ability of some countries, even receiving help from international organizations, their capacity to absorb these resources and allocate efficiently. Here, we're talking about resources and efficiency to increase efficiency as much as possible. I believe that if we look at absorption capacity measures, we will see that developing countries are less efficient, I beg your pardon, and maybe there will be more waste. And it is a difficulty, especially regarding the COVID-19 and countries that have still ahead of them a large deficit to materialize the SDGs. They will need to increase efficiency quite a lot of the few resources that will be available to them. Another point regarding Martin's presentation, still following. It is, of course, a negative adverse shock, but it doesn't mean it doesn't bring opportunities. And Martin mentions that about the way we can change the energy matrix in the world, looking for greater sustainability and greater efficiency. And this is not going to be the first time that this happens in the economic history. We had the other pandemics before. We had several banks breaking, collapsing, banks and companies collapsing, but those who remained increased scale. So several sciences, statistics, mathematics evolved after these adverse shocks, and these points can guide our challenges ahead. Be more efficient, knowing there are negative shocks, but we can transform these into good opportunities of gain with disruptive innovations that will emerge. We do have questions, and Adalgisa, we have some questions in the chat. If you could let us know.
Claro. Vamos lá.
Sure. The question has a lot to do with what you said just now. How can financial institutions work to reduce dramatic impact of COVID-19 in the countries?
Yes, thank you very much, Luiz. I think there is a clear role for the international organizations and international financial organizations to help. As you said, there is limited fiscal space in most of the countries, even before the crisis, not across the entire region. Peru, Chile, Colombia started on a better footing. But the way we fought the pandemic was a bit like a sprint. We went into spending as if we only had a few months to hold. And it's becoming gradually a marathon. And we cannot run a marathon in the same way we run a sprint. We cannot continue having 10 extra points of public debt over GDP every year. Getting finance in cheap conditions, as you can get from the multilaterals, or even in the case of the IMF, getting your quota back, all these things really help. I think it also helps. We are now in a relatively favorable international environment, despite everything. We still have low interest rates. The kind of fears there were on emerging markets at the beginning of the pandemic, when the withdrawal of short-term capital from emerging economies, emerging markets, and developing countries was even bigger than in the global financial crisis, went away. Now we have country risk premiums that are low. We have even surprising circumstances, like Peru being able to issue a 100-year bond in a week where they had 3 presidents. Well, this may not last forever. And markets will start asking where is that they can put their money confidently and where is that they have to be worried. And I see also there a role for international financial organizations, which is to help countries think through the policy options. Like Paulo said, if you have to do fiscal consolidation, what is the best path to fiscal consolidation so that you protect the social side, but at the same time, you don't jeopardize your debt sustainability. Being associated with programs that signal to the international community that countries are being serious in their policies. All these roles will be very important for international financial organizations going forward, both on the finance, on the advice, and then on the signal. Thank you.
Sure, thank you. If I understood correctly, this is the role of international institutions. I think Martin already mentioned the points. Just to add that the fund has provided significant support, exceptional support to countries, low-income countries, emerging markets. We have provided debt relief, and we continue to work with the major donors, international donors, to can bring more initiatives of debt relief for low-income countries to help those any pressures, any financing, funding pressures they may have, so that they can deal with the crisis the best possible way. We have also provided credit lines to several emerging markets, including Latin America, to help them manage these very difficult crisis and high degree of uncertainty. And as Martin said, we are always willing and talking to our country members to find ways to better invest the quality of investment, but also to improve the policy responses to the crisis and manage their public finances in the most effective way. So I think those are the most important. We have maybe also to mention that again, we continue to work in international forums and with other organizations to ensure support to all the countries in the world, including to ensure that everyone gets the vaccines as soon as possible. This is absolutely priority number one. But we continue to on different areas also, as I mentioned before, very much in line with Martin. So I think we all have to cooperate together to get out of this crisis as soon as possible.
Muito bem, então podemos seguir para a próxima pergunta, que é a seguinte: quais as ações estudadas?
Next question. What actions can be formulated for the Amazon region and the development institutions that work with the Bank of the Amazon?
Well, it's a very specific question. Part of it, for instance, we addressed it in a previous issue of our semi-annual report, in which, for instance, we try to explore how something that we see as very important, deep trade agreements, which are one of the tools in the toolkit for development, what are the implications on several fronts? Growth, of course, inequality or inclusion, but also sustainability. I mentioned these deep trade agreements because one of the issues that has restrained growth, that has slowed down growth in our region, is limited competition. We have vested interest, we have barriers, and when we reform often, these obstacles to competition pop up again in some other way. Deep trade agreements, like the one that the US, Mexico, and Canada signed, or the one that the EU and Mercosur had considered and is waiting for ratification, have this interest that they go beyond trade. They go behind the border, and they touch on issues like subsidies, like state-owned enterprises, public procurement, labor standards, also environmental standards. So these are tools that have the advantage that one can, in a package, in a whole package, deal with growth, but also tackle some other issues. And so in that report a few months ago, we simulated the consequences of EU-Mercosur agreement, including, for instance, in the case of Brazil and Uruguay and Argentina, how the change in the composition of output could impact on deforestation. And it's very clear that in each of the areas we studied, environmental but also social, there is a need for complementary policies. And so I would say my first answer, without going specifically to the Amazon, is that among the big decisions, as Paulo said, in the coming months, in the coming years, policymakers will have to make important decisions for the future. This is really a turning point, is a crossroads in many ways. And this idea that we need growth, we need competition, but we need to ensure that it's sustainable is very important. The point I made in my presentation about the opportunities that we have from having such a clean energy matrix, and that we are wasting because we don't have enough, for instance, electricity trade. Brazil is having a growing demand for electricity. It could get cheap electricity from other parts of the region that is clean electricity. So there are several measures. I don't think there is a silver bullet to address sustainability. It's very clear that our countries need to grow. It's very clear also that inclusion has to be at the forefront. Now we missed the time before COVID, but we should remember that in 2019, the region had 12 episodes of social unrest that show that people were unhappy with inclusion, with accountability, with transparency. So thinking, the way Paulo said, thinking that this is an opportunity and that we have to combine growth, inclusion, and sustainability will be very important. And in the case of Brazil, of course, the Amazon and the signaling the Amazon provides to the rest of the world about the determination of Brazil to care about sustainability is extremely important. Thank you.
I'd like to thank you immensely for the opportunity. We could stay much longer discussing all these topics, which are major challenges. We know, we are aware of the efforts of the World Bank and the IMF, systematic efforts to increase the effectiveness of policies. And I'd like to thank you very much for your participation. Martin, please, your final remarks, and then we'll give the floor to Paulo.
Thank you, Luiz. I will make the following point. In the middle of a crisis as severe as this one, where so many lives have been lost, where the decline in GDP has been so brutal, so unprecedented, it is very easy to be extremely pessimistic, extremely negative. But if we look back in history, there were huge crises from which the global economy came back strong, but in different ways. Think of the Spanish flu a century ago. The Spanish flu, in terms of lives lost, was even worse than COVID. About 20 million people died, which in proportion of the world population at the time was gigantic. And this was after a world war that had killed so many people and devastated so many economies. What came after the pandemic, the Spanish flu, was the Roaring 20s, was a period of fabulous growth, a very chaotic growth, but a fabulous growth. Same thing after World War II. You could say, oh, with so much destruction, physical capital loss, human lives lost, dislocation, the economy was doomed. And still we had one of the phases of prosperity that were the most important in the world. But there was a big difference between these two episodes. The one after the Spanish flu ended up with the Great Depression. We went in a way that was uncontrolled, especially on the financial side, and it all went down in a terrible way. The prosperity that came after World War II, built on strong institutions, on open systems, was a lasting prosperity. And I think, as Paulo said, now we are in the middle of a crisis, but the decisions that will be made in these years, in terms of growth, in terms of inclusion, in terms of sustainability, will determine whether we are going like in the Roaring 20s, whether we are going like in the glorious period after World War II, or whether we continue in the kind of mediocre growth that characterized Latin America and the Caribbean for such a long time. Thank you.
Paulo, obrigado.
Thank you. Paulo, your final remarks, please.
Okay, thank you very much. I absolutely agree with Martin. I think this is a tremendous moment in history. I would like also to add a point, I think, a related point is that this crisis also showed the importance and the role of governments. Governments are absolutely key to help respond to crisis. Governments are absolutely key to how we're going to address some of our key challenges ahead, including the inequality and poverty, but also the new crisis. We have seen that countries that were better prepared dealt better with crisis. And we have one that is coming fast, the climate change. And if we act now, we're going to be much better prepared for the future. And governments have really absolute key role here. And they have taken incredible measures and moved very fast during this pandemic. And showing that when governments move, the results are better, that protect people and firms. So we need to build on that. We need governments to become more effective, more efficient, more transparent, with greater accountability. Governments that deliver the basic services to all the populations and that have appropriate safety nets. Governments that can guide the societies for better equilibriums and to prepare, make the economy resilient to future shocks. So I think this is really, the crisis has shown the importance of governments, and governments now need to respond by becoming even better, by efficient accountability, transparency, governance. So this, I think, it's a challenge for governments, and the populations are asking for it. So, and as Martin said, this is important so that we have a great future ahead. This is going to be important. Thank you very much for the invitation.
Muito obrigado a todos. Eu acho que a gente teve
Thank
painel.
you. I believe we had an excellent high-level panel with two institutions that work very hard for us to achieve development. Thank you once again, and congratulations to ABDE. Thank you very much. It was a pleasure to share this panel with you.